What's up, guys, and welcome to the Level Health Podcast. Today, we're interviewing Brad Watts, a registered dietitian that has a knack for cutting through the bullshit and explaining what actually matters when it comes to nutrition. In this episode, we talk about some of the common myths and misconceptions surrounding nutrition, who is actually qualified to give nutrition advice, just how incredibly individualized your approach may be, and how the dietitian profession can improve overall. Big thanks to Brad for coming on our show. You can follow him on Instagram at nutritioncollective_RD. We'll have that linked in the description down below. His content is informational and funny, so go check him out. For those of you that don't already know, our website, Level Health, is a directory, community, and network of qualified health and fitness professionals. We want to help create a space where clients and patients are able to find the right professionals for them. If you haven't signed up already, head over to levelhealth.net and set up your membership. Thanks for listening, and we hope you enjoy the episode.
But also then I was thinking about how I've recently transitioned away from training clients because I'm going back to school. I'm in school full time. I'm more than full time right now. And I know I wasn't going to be able to give them that focus that I needed to. But that was so scary because it's like, that was, for one, my whole identity. And the reason I'm in the fitness industry is to help people. But looking at it from a different perspective, I'm able to help people in a different way now. So it's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
All right. So I actually had some questions for you. And we were going to go just rapid fire for the first few, because I wanted to cover some real basic, really myths in the nutrition space and stuff that we could probably just kind of squash right away. That it seems like it's dying, but I mean, it's kind of pervasive. So it's going to take a long time to get out of popular culture, popular media, and everything like that. But before we actually get started, could you give us just some background on who you are and how you ended up doing what you're doing now?
Yeah, so I'm currently a registered dietitian, and I got into that it evolved kind of early on through the kind of interest in fitness and everything, because I've been athletic, my whole life pretty much. Um, and that's what got me interested in nutrition. And then as I went through school and learning all this stuff and kind of changing where my career goals were, I thought it would be pretty cool to work with professional athletes and things like that. And most of the time it's required to be a dietitian if you want to be at that high level. So I was like, okay, I'll go into dietetics, and then that's where I kind of also pretty enjoyed the medical nutrition therapy side, actual caring for patients and individuals that I think got me stuck in, I'll probably stick with clinical for a while before um, branching out into either private practice or working with athletes, because I know it's my opinion and the opinion of many others that having that um, clinical foundation and knowledge is important for any area of dietetics you go into, because that is kind of the core basis of what a dietitian does. They work in food service, they work in community settings that might not have the clinical aspect to it, but just having that foundation of knowledge is, I think, what makes the practitioner pretty solid in what they're able to do.
Yeah, I mean, I saw some of your Instagram posts. Actually, my girlfriend Haley pointed out you put up some big weight on some lifts. Like, I mean, you were doing like what 440, 450 at 140.
Yeah, that was before the pandemic and everything closed. That's I was like on my way to being um an elite power lifter, and then everything gym started closing. I was like, ah, whatever. I don't care too much anymore. So like,
Yeah,
of course I still lift and everything, but the drive to be elite isn't really there anymore, because it's just like, kind of fell off of it.
how are you? Would you be able to balance that with your workload now? I know that, I mean, being an elite anything, a competitor of any kind takes,
Yeah.
you're going to have to prioritize certain things in your life. So is that something that you'd be able to balance? 'Cause I think a lot of professionals, we kind of bite off more than we can chew in terms of fitness, strength goals, stuff like that.
And definitely when I was training for that, specifically powerlifting, for the whole year, nothing else, no like aesthetic focus, no bodybuilding focus. It was pure powerlifting. And it was pretty average training, 5 days a week. It was like hour 15 at max per day. So it wasn't anything crazy that I had to do. Um, so I think I still could do it, but it's just my drive for it to do it is not really there anymore. I don't care as much, so it's probably not something I'd necessarily push for anytime soon.
Yeah. What are some of the differences between that medical nutrition therapy working in a clinical setting and working with athletes? I mean, you said that the basics obviously are the same. I mean, it kind of reminds me of like if you can work on a Civic, you can work on a Ferrari, but I'm sorry,
Yeah.
if you can work on a Ferrari, you can work on a Civic, but not vice versa. You have to have that foundation first in order to get into the little bit more elite stuff like that. So, what are the big differences between working with normal people and athletes?
So, kind of picking apart um, medical nutrition therapy specifically, um, that really details managing diseases. Like we have a nutrition care manual that we kind of follow. It's like a reference guide. Of course, it's a expensive paid subscription. There's tons of those.
Of course.
But it has pretty much any kind of condition you could imagine, health condition, and guidelines on what to do for it. Assessment, interpretation of labs, other biochemical data, other clinical diagnoses, um, the validation of the interventions. So it's got all this stuff for any kind of disease state you can imagine. So that's where it kind of gets more complicated in trying to manage those things. So it is very heavily relied upon the whole interdisciplinary team, um, unless you're in private practice and doing it on your own. But if you're in the clinic, you're talking to the doctors and nurses, all the speech therapy, everything else to try to manage that patient's condition. Of course, the doctors are doing, through their medications or other treatments, whether it be like maybe for cancer, they doing chemo. Obviously, I'm not going to be doing that. I'm just going to be helping the individual manage their dietary intake while they're going through chemo, because that's obviously a very difficult and challenging thing. Everyone loses their appetite, they feel sick all the time. So it would be my job to help them manage that through their treatment. That's just one example with cancer or something.
Is
But
that
it's
a
like
big
that.
part of it? Is working with other professionals in your network, working with people that are specialized in other aspects and really communicating and handling it together?
Yeah, definitely, because you want to stay in your scope as best as possible, because we have a scope of practice
Yeah.
that's outlined. We have, code of ethics, standards of professional performance. We have all these things that we have to abide by. Um, so if you don't know something or you need more information, you would have to reach out to that whoever your team member is, whether it be the physician, whether it be the pharmacist. Reach out, say, hey, do you know about this? Can you get this for me? So it's a big part of it is working with the interdisciplinary team. If you're in a clinic, if you're on your own, you might, it's good to, get in network with other physicians who may refer their patients to you. So you would be able to review their chart, whatever, get all the information you need. And then maybe the doctor referred them to you for diabetes care. You would just manage the diabetes. You would know what medications or treatment the doctor is giving, and then you would help them manage their dietary and lifestyle aspect. So it's kind of, it all goes hand in hand, but of course, it just depends on what situation you're in.
You mentioned scope of practice, and I um I've kind of always noticed this, but even more so recently, I'll see somebody's post and I'm like, oh, that is actually, I don't know if you can say that you are a quote unquote nutritionist, that you took a 6 month certification and you're telling people that you can fix their hormones and prevent or reverse infertility and all this stuff. I'm like, are you
Yeah.
sure? It
Yeah, that's
must.
a big thing I'll be griping on. That's like the common theme of this whole thing is
I
gonna
can only
be.
imagine. Yeah, it must be frustrating seeing that kind of stuff on social media.
Yeah.
But all right, so if you're ready, let's go ahead and just roll through some rapid fire questions, because like I said, these are myths that are incredibly pervasive, but I think
Hmm.
that the science is pretty solid, and like if anybody would do a little background on them, they'd realize that some of these things are just ridiculous that they're even being talked about anymore. So
Yeah.
first one, are carbs bad for you? Are carbohydrates bad for you in your diet?
No. Next question.
Yeah,
No, I'm
very
kidding.
good.
I'll point out one thing. Like most of these kind of this kind of misinformation, or like these crazy ideas or whatever that people come up with, if you look at who like came up with it, who's promoting it, it's very rare to see an actual professional promote it. It's usually some random person. So that's where all the misinformation comes from. Like if you just follow the dietary guidelines, you listen to all the state organizations and what they tell you to do, you'd be pretty solid. But all the misinformation comes from these random people just making stuff up and trying to sell something or make some money. So that's why the water gets kind of muddy, is you have the non-professionals loudly sharing this information, and that's what the public sees compared to what the actual professionals are telling you to do. That's not fun or exciting, I guess. So that's why this kind of gets all crazy.
Fun or exciting? That's funny because I mean, why are we drawn to the fun and exciting and rather than the effective? It's just one of those things, I guess. But all right, moving on. Is fat bad for you? Is dietary fat in your diet bad?
I should have said this before. The answer to everything is it depends.
Yeah.
But for in terms of dietary fat, usually it comes down to um, the type rather than the amount, um, and the type being, saturated versus unsaturated. Um, and for the majority of people, most of the time, large or excessive amounts of anything really, but in terms of saturated fat, that can increase your risk for cardiovascular disease, for uh, you know, diabetes, hypertension, all these things. So the in a normal amount, saturated fat, it's part of anyone's diet. It's nearly impossible to avoid. And we have guidelines for it. Saturated fat should consist of 10% or less of total calories in the diet. There's a simple guideline to follow. And for those already with cardiovascular disease, that moves down to 7%. So we have these established guidelines. Do people want to listen to them? No, not really, because they're guidelines because they have the evidence to support them. That's why they're there, to help kind of tell the public what may be best for them that they see in the whole population of the studies they've done. So for fat, saturated fat, probably best to keep below 10% of the total calories. Um, could you do more? Maybe. Not everyone will have the same rise in triglycerides, rise in cholesterol from eating the same amount of saturated fat. Everyone's different. But generally, we see those who consume more saturated fat to have higher levels of cholesterol, higher triglycerides, higher risk for cardiovascular disease. And when you compare that to unsaturated fats, those unsaturated fats usually have the opposite effect. If someone already has high cholesterol, incorporate more unsaturated fats may help lower that. Those omega-3s, which are the essential fatty acid, that's pretty good at lowering triglycerides. Um, and of course, it's essential, so we need it. But like monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, olive oil, canola oil, those things. Everyone wants to hate on canola oil for whatever reason. Everyone says it's toxic or something. Um, and people like to hate on, omega-6 fatty acids, which is also an essential fat. But if you take the time to look at the quality evidence, all the research out there, you see that these unsaturated fats are usually neutral to beneficial to cardiovascular health. So, like you said, if which is, taking the time to read through the research is difficult. Interpreting research, reading it is difficult, and they use pretty complicated words, complicated methods. So it may be, not, I wouldn't say impossible, but very difficult for just the average person to be able to interpret that. That's why you have the professionals there. That's why you have the guidelines there that take all that into account and then provide it in a easier to understand, maybe guideline to the general public.
Those people that the people doing research reviews, the science communicators, I think they would like to call themselves, are so valuable. But again, they are presenting this information with the statement "it depends" in front of it, which is the truth, 100%. It does depend. The individualization in nutrition and everything with humans is so vast, but it almost falls on deaf ears to some people because it's not do this, do that. I wanted to touch on one more thing on fat though. Olive oil. I'm hoping so. Olive oil seems to be the golden child. I hope that. Is there anything that makes us think? Obviously, not in excess. I don't know anybody that's drinking bottles of olive oil, but is olive oil, and then you said canola oil as well. unprocessed, in their most natural states, well, in the oil at that point, but as unprocessed and unheated and everything like that, are those still okay?
Yeah, like anything you would buy from the store, like usually with extra virgin olive oil, you see cold pressed or whatever. And don't quote me on this. I think that's cold press is just if it's like processed with heat, it may lead to more oxidation or rancidity or something like that. So it decreases the quality of it. That's just what I think. That's what I might have read one time. So who knows? But I think cold press is just to maintain the quality better.
Okay.
And so, like anything you could buy from the grocery store, um, it's not gonna hurt you. Like
Yeah.
that's what the FDA is there for, to kind of regulate what gets what gets sold to the consumer. And like I would say most of the time, if it's allowed in the food product, it's recognized as safe and not carcinogenic in the amount that it's there. So if it's that this doesn't include dietary supplements because those aren't
Yeah.
regulated a lot, but like the general food you could get in the store is gonna be fine as long as you're not your diet doesn't consist solely of Twinkies. But
On that note, on the Twinkie note, the next question: processed foods, wholly bad, wholly good? Like, where are we
hmm
standing on processed food? Is it depend obviously on the food itself?
yeah, so processed is kind of a blanket term for anything that's not in the state that it would come in. Like if you buy a bag of sliced apples, that's processed.
Yeah.
If you buy a can of green beans, that's processed. If you buy a fillet of salmon, that's processed. So, and a Twinkie is also processed. So there's a huge range of what processed actually means. Um, so like with the foods I was just talking about, the the lower amount of processed a food is may be better, but you know, it all it all depends. If it's if it's something you regularly include in your diet, you have a Twinkie every day, that's probably not gonna do much. It's just a Twinkie. Like it's not that big of a deal. But it's if the diet consists more of those heavily processed foods, if that makes up more of the diet, if that and because those kind of more heavily processed foods usually have more sodium, more added sugars, may have more saturated fat. So that's the culmination of all those factors that kind of lead to a lower diet quality.
Is the 80/20 rule pretty solid? I mean, you hear that from a lot of people in terms of 80% whole natural food as much as possible, and then include a little bit more processed foods.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of I've how do I say this? It's kind of like I'm on the fence about just saying like obviously you can't say this to everyone, but it's just food.
Yeah.
It's not obviously it does have an impact on your health and everything, and it's not something you should just go willy-nilly about, but it's just food. Eat it. You eat the foods you enjoy, you know. Be conscious about the foods you eat. Don't go overboard on anything. Sometimes we eat out with friends, we eat too much, and that's what happens, but um it is just food. It does impact your health, so it's good to be conscious of the foods you eat, but um, it shouldn't be so um, such a huge focus of where you have to deliberately put so much of your attention on it that you have to create these rules or whatever or restrictions or something like that. So um, again, that kind of comes from people not knowing what they're talking about, saying you should do this, you should do that. Um, so in my stance, and it's going to depend on who I'm talking to. I'm not going to tell that to someone who has an eating disorder, obviously,
Yeah.
but um, for the general person who's not already at increased risk for developing a certain disease, for just a general person, me and you, it's not super that big of a deal to have to spend so much time worrying about how many chips we're eating or whatever. Because like
I
I eat chips almost every night. It's just I like chips, so I eat them, and it's not that big of a deal.
Yeah, that's a recent thing for me, is including things like that. I mean, I spent It's kind of not to say it's embarrassing, but it's I spent a better part of a decade or more hyper focused on food to the point where I was probably in a deficit or maintenance at most while I was trying to build muscle because I was so
Hmm.
focused on not including these hyper palatable processed,
Yeah.
bad foods. I was assigning moral value to foods, and gosh, that's those thought patterns are so ingrained that it's definitely hard to step away from. But I have started to include it. Like we had Halloween candy, and I was just going through the bag over the course of 6 months instead of
Yeah.
restricting, and then I have one piece, and then I just binge on it. And I
Hmm.
never really associate or saw those tendencies in myself until I took a step back and like, oh shit, I really did do these kind of restrict binge patterns,
Yeah.
not to the degree as some people, but it certainly was there. Moving on, dietary cholesterol. What is it? Is it bad for you? Does eating cholesterol impact your blood levels? Again, it's going to depend,
Hmm.
but where are we at on
Yeah.
that?
Um, so with cholesterol, it's primarily in animal products. Our bodies produce it. It's really necessary in like the kind of like membranes of our cells. Provides um, structure to the cell membranes and things like that, and it's involved in transportation of things in our blood. So it's obviously we need it, and that's why we produce it. But and I think the more it's kind of like the negative feedback, like the more cholesterol you eat, the less you produce. Um, so dietary cholesterol doesn't have, a huge impact on um, your labs, your cholesterol levels. It does have some, but not such an extreme effect that you would have to like never eat cholesterol ever again. You know, if, and the of course, going back to the medical nutrition therapy, it's different for someone who already has cardiovascular disease, who already has high cholesterol. For those people, okay, maybe limit the cholesterol and also saturated fat because saturated fat can affect that too. So but for the normal person, eating a couple eggs a day is not going to do anything. Eggs are pretty high in cholesterol, but um, eating a regular amount of animal products, not a carnivore level, but a
Mhm.
normal level of animal products, is usually not going to have a large impact. Um, but if you did reduce your dietary cholesterol, you may notice a few points reduction in your lab values. So, it's there, but not super significant to where you should be micromanaging every gram of cholesterol you have.
Is it something that really we shouldn't even really necessarily be concerned with until and unless it becomes an issue in your labs?
Yeah, like
Okay.
it came out of the dietary recommendations to limit cholesterol because
Mm.
the research was finding that it just didn't have a huge impact on your lab values. But again, if you have kind of that maybe poor dietary habits where you are consuming lots of saturated fat, lots of cholesterol, and you may be overweight and you might not have cardiovascular disease yet, but you are at increased risk. Those would be the times that you should be looking at limiting those things.
I think it may take a few generations before gets rid of that like bad, ominous like
Yeah,
idea that people have about it. All right, another one right on that same spectrum is salt and sodium.
yeah.
Avoid it, get it. What do we do with it?
It might depend on who you ask. Um, Generally, because I know there's like it varies from like nation to nation on sodium intakes and how healthy their population is. So I know like more of the Asian countries like Japan and Korea, I know they have very high sodium intakes. They eat a lot of pickled foods and it's just very high on their diet, yet they're one of the healthiest populations in the world. So again, it comes down to one individual aspect not affecting the whole. It's a culmination of everything. But the general recommendations for sodium are to keep it at or below 2,400 milligrams. That's just the general recommendation because excessive sodium um, can lead to and maybe like an independent risk factor of cardiovascular disease because it is kind of tied to hypertension. And it depends on the person himself, how their organs function. because normally the more sodium you eat, the more you'll excrete. So if you eat a lot, you'll just pee the excess out. Some people's kidneys may not work the same as other people's, so they may not excrete as much. Or sodium, it's kind of like the term salt sensitive. Some people may not notice an increase in blood pressure from sodium, some may. But if we're talking about someone who does have hypertension, um, that is a time that we would look at limiting sodium, because all the studies out there very clearly demonstrate that a reduction in sodium can meaningfully reduce blood pressure. So again, it seems like every time I'm going back to the normal person, and then there's obviously a indication for someone with a certain disease. So it's like general population, and then of course there's other more specific cases where you would want to make these changes.
But I think that's kind of where people, professionals like yourselves, are required. Because if there was no individualization, like you could just, okay, we figured it out, everybody do this, and then if you don't do that, I mean, you know the right thing to do. So, but there's so much that goes into it for separate people.
Mhm.
All right, so it kind of touches on this already, but good and bad foods, is there such thing?
Um, I would say no, not really, but in terms of how you want someone to look at foods, it's because good and bad, it's simple to understand. You
Hmm.
know, something's good, oh, you want more of that. Something's bad, oh, you want less of that. Um, and but it's easy to understand, but it may not be the best outlook. Some people don't have a problem with it. Like the generation before us, they lived on good and bad foods. Most of them, they do fine. They don't have a fear of eating foods. That's just something that seems more apparent these days, is having a fear of certain foods. But um, labeling, labeling food as good or bad is just kind of a way to um, push someone into leaning to consume less of a food as compared to consume more of a food, because the good foods are the fruits, vegetables, whole grains, lean meats, dairy, and we want people to consume more of. The bad foods, are the all the baked goods, the cakes, the brownies, the cookies, the Twinkies that we're not going to tell someone, no, you can never have these in your life, but those are the foods we just want to have less of, less often. For some people, labeling it as good and bad is just easier to understand, and for them, it does not lead to poor relationships with food. It's just an easier way to understand. But a lot of which has been becoming more apparent now is that more people are kind of putting this morality on food that shouldn't be there. Um, that's just something that's kind of developed more in our time. So speaking with maybe that population, labeling is not a thing you should do.
Yeah.
Um, and it's just again, like in terms of just tying it all back into overall diet, and not kind of separating things black and white. It's all a spectrum, it's all a continuum. And you would tell them, there's foods that may be more beneficial, more nutritious for you, and foods that do not provide, the same nutrients. But at the same time, who cares if those foods are good too? You can eat them.
Yeah.
So you don't have to, just because something's not as nutritious doesn't mean you shouldn't eat it. It's just an objective way to define something. It doesn't mean it's bad. It's just that's the facts about it, and you can eat it if you want because it tastes good usually.
Yeah. So, if anything, we should be grateful that we even have the opportunity to decide that foods are good and bad. I don't think that's ever happened in the history of the world for an entire population, where
Yeah,
you're able to be like, okay, well, I'm not going to eat that food. I'm going to eat this food.
hmm
Okay, what happened to starving? Like that, there's
yeah,
still a place in the world that's happening, but I mean, we have a lot of conveniences now that have created these weird associations with food. You mentioned dairy though, so
hmm
that's something that only very recently has kind of been vindicated. I think. Can you just real quick just tell us about where we're at on dairy?
yeah. Again, if you look at where those comments come from, you'd see it's these people that are way out of pocket on what they're trying to do. Um, dairy. It's one of those things that people who have an intolerance to it, obviously you shouldn't eat it. But for the general population, all the research shows a neutral to beneficial effect of dairy in terms of overall health, disease risk, Obviously, something like osteoporosis or type 2 diabetes, dairy consumption seems to reduce the risk for developing that. It's obviously a very high quality protein. It's got lots of nutrients.
It's a great
So
protein source, isn't it?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And like it does have, like whole milk, 2% milk does have saturated fat in it. But the weird thing is like, you know, eh, nutrients kind of act differently depending on the food matrix they're in. Like saturated fat and butter may raise your cholesterol more than saturated fat in milk. So it's just like one of those nuanced things. But the recommendation is for low fat or fat free dairy. Um, that doesn't mean you can never have whole milk, but it's just again trying to get the population to watch out for the saturated fat intake and calorie intake and kind of choose those less, I'll stop there. It's dairy's a good thing.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's just opting for those lower fat versions are just an easy way to cut calories. And for most
Hmm.
people, honestly, like that's something that should be considered because we
Yeah.
have an issue with movement and everything like that. Okay, so three more here, real quick, and they're all kind of interrelated. So, benefits of supplementation. I see often. I mean, I keep seeing this ad where somebody drinks a shot of something and the fat's just melting off of them. That's one that really, I think that's kind of the extreme version, but supplementation, I mean, boosting metabolism, the marketing around that, and then like detox teas and things like that.
Hmm. Yeah. Of course, supplements are a huge industry. A lot of money to be made in it. Um, and there's obviously tons of them, tons of different kinds, all that purportedly do different things. But in terms of maybe dietary supplements, um, like vitamins and minerals, those can have a place in someone. We use them all the time in the hospital. But if someone has a deficiency, it's objectively identified either through lab values or for what I would do, a nutrition focused physical exam to look out for these deficiencies. So if it's objectively diagnosed, then, you know, you would supplement with whatever vitamin or mineral that person's deficient in. So, multivitamins obviously have a place. Um,
You just can't say broad spectrum, everybody needs magnesium, until
yeah,
you see that they need that, or
yeah,
whatever,
yeah.
sub that in.
Yeah. And multivitamins are one of those things like, there's obviously, I would say there's better ones than others. Um, but generally taking one's not going to do any harm. Like as long as like just one, like the prescribed amount, like one a
Yeah.
day is probably not gonna do anything, not gonna do any harm. So,
Yeah.
I mean, it's one of those things like you can take it if you want. Is it gonna give you a benefit? Maybe, maybe not. Is it gonna produce harm? Probably not. So it's one of those things like it's probably safe to do if you wanted to, but again, you always have to ask yourself, why am I doing this? Why do I need to do this? That's just
Is
on
it worth the
multivitamins.
cost?
Yeah,
Am
yeah.
I spending $90 a month on supplements? I used to spend $300 a month on supplements when I was pretty dang poor too. So that was primarily, I mean, I would, include the men's one a day. I'd buy the
Yeah.
cheapest multivitamin, but then I'd buy the best protein, the best
Mhm.
creatine, the best pre-workout, things like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, like protein powders, they have a place if someone has trouble consuming a lot of protein, if someone doesn't have a huge appetite, someone just, happens to need more, like there are certain disease states which require higher protein. We use, Ensures a lot, Ensure Boost, whatever brand you want. We use those a lot. Um, so again, they have a place. There are some that are better than others. Um, there's different kinds like whey, like pea protein, like hemp protein, like all these different kinds. And I would say generally, they're a dime a dozen. You can pick any one. As long, like I said, there are better ones than others, but they're pretty run of the mill protein powders. It's whatever. For sports supplements, there's very few that actually have a defined effect that has been studied. So like if you look at like something like a C4 pre-workout, I don't know, I think that's the brand, like they have so many ingredients that, they say does this, does that, but is there any information to support that? Probably not. They're just filler ingredients. It's probably just the caffeine that you're feeling,
Yeah.
you know. Again, there are better pre-workouts than others that I've seen. Um, let's see, in
That
terms
was a
of,
huge boost to my budget when I stopped paying $50 a month for pre-workout supplements and just, I mean, you could spend $10 on 200 caffeine pills. And like you said, that's going to be primarily
yeah,
the active ingredient that you're feeling.
yeah.
So
Definitely like something like a, like you see all these like juices or, like you said, detox products or whatever. Um, that's one that's just way out of pocket. That's just people trying to make money, either trying to scare the public into thinking something or misleading them into thinking something. Or, a lot of the times it's just a lot of with these things that people that don't know what they're talking about, it's just flat out like lying. Like
it's so
they're
outrageous.
100,
Yeah.
100% untruthful with what they're saying. Um, and like something like a detox, it's not a thing we can do unless it's like medically indicated, like you have alcohol poisoning or something. But like an over-the-counter juice is not gonna do anything except make you eat less,
I
maybe
saw
make
a
you go to the
video.
bathroom.
Yeah, exactly. I saw a video yesterday. It was I didn't pay attention to the recipe at all. I remember seeing mint and like orange peel or something, and this guy made a smoothie that allegedly gave you quality muscle and skin. And I just wanted to ask this person, what does quality muscle mean? What does
Yeah,
that mean? What is the mechanism behind this?
yeah, like with a lot of the claims, you're like, if someone says this is toxic or whatever, you're like, okay, well, what in that is toxic? Um, and some people will say, oh, you have like 10 to 20 pounds of toxins in your colon. I'm like, can someone just critically think for a minute and think if you had 10 pounds of something that was truly toxic, do you think you'd be dead or you'd be living happy? Like,
You wouldn't feel that at all in your
yeah,
intestine, in your colon. You
like yeah,
wouldn't feel that.
if you ask someone like, what does this mean? How does it work? How does this do that? They can't explain it because it's not a real thing.
Yeah, a lot of times people. I mean, it may not even be malicious. They just didn't think through it. Oftentimes, it's obvious that it's malicious, that they're just trying to make money off people. And I think
Mhm.
sometimes they make these claims so outrageous that only the people that believe them will respond to them. It's kind of
Yeah.
like the email phishing, where they send out the most ridiculous
Mhm.
email so they know who responds is going to fall for it.
Yeah, and like you said, it is malicious. Some of these things target like people with cancer and people with other diseases that it is likely harmful for them to actually do. So, these things could be reported for health fraud, and these people would either be sued or be imprisoned because it's malicious, it's harmful, and it's way outside of their non-existent scope because they're just an average person. That,
Yeah,
yeah.
I think some of them can be kind of insidiously malicious because say you're selling something to somebody that's just for weight loss. You don't know if this person that's maybe the 10th thing that they've tried and they just keep chalking up L's and you're just handing
Mhm.
them a loss because it's like this is never going to work in the first place. And you're just
Yeah.
like, here, try this. Oh, your brain's going to be like, oh, I can't do this because this
Uh-huh.
failed, this failed. And now next thing you know, they've just had that learned helplessness
Mhm.
effect. It's
Yeah.
disappointing. Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of those things that's like it is truly harmful that, and it's sad to see that it happens so often.
Yeah. All right. So a little bit more deep questions here. So nutrition misinformation in the mainstream social media and popular culture. We could talk about this all day, I'm sure. And
Yeah.
it seems like these kind of happen in cyclical patterns. Something's a fad for a while and then it comes and goes
Hmm.
and it gets brought back 20 years later. Currently, though, because I think that's the most practical for people, what are some examples of misinformation about nutrition in popular media? I mean, you could probably talk about Dr. Oz himself for days, but just in popular media and social media, what are you seeing right now that's the most egregious bits of misinformation?
Yeah, again, it comes from the people who have no business providing this information. Um, we don't, when I say we, just like us, me as like the profession and people in healthcare, things like that, we don't like using extremes. That's not usually a good way to go about things. Usually having a more balanced approach is what would seem obvious to be the best approach, but
Extreme sell well, though.
yeah, it does. So going off both sides of the extreme, there's people that say, and this one's been going on for a while, but like uh, strict veganism is the best for overall health. Um, and I can see their arguments for it, but it's not really demonstrated in the evidence. And and you see with a lot of the extremes that they are very, again, malicious and angry if you don't agree with them. They, attack you, not like in person, but
Mhm.
verbally
Oh,
attack
of
you.
course not. Of course not in
Yeah,
person.
they never fight. So they, instead of, if you try to like question them, they don't want to have a conversation. They just want to say, I'm right, this is the best. And if you don't do it, you're an awful person. So you see that a lot with the extreme sides, because they don't really have true arguments that would hold up to the scrutiny of any kind of evidence.
Mhm.
So again, they kind of just use personal attacks and all these fallacies and everything. And I will say this: you can live perfectly fine on a vegan diet. You just have to pay extra attention. You will likely have to supplement some things, but it's a feasible way to live. On the other side, you have the can you, can you see where I'm going with this one? The other
Yeah.
side, yeah, the carnivore side
Hmm.
is one that is just absolutely absurd. I don't know. Well, I do know who's talking about it, but um, that's just one that is completely way out of the park. No, and again, this comes back to people critically thinking. Um, the carnivore people make a lot of claims that obviously aren't supported by anything. Um, Eating only meat is clearly not a good thing because it doesn't have all the nutrients that humans need. Um, and I guess you could say, oh, just supplement it, whatever. But um, going back on only meat and fiber, fiber is very important in the diet. It's been demonstrated time and time again to have beneficial effects on disease and overall health. So excluding fiber is just a, one strike there. It's obvious. No fiber, no
Yeah, you
plant
could
foods,
almost stop there, right? You could almost
yeah,
be like, okay, well,
yeah.
where's your fiber in your diet? Oh,
Where's your
that's
fiber? All the plants, foods have phytochemicals, antioxidants that you're not going to be getting through meat alone. Um, Again, they probably have a very high, this is where we get into the extremes of having a very high saturated fat and cholesterol intake, which is probably going to have a very pronounced effect on your health. Um, so, and again, if you try to question them, they'll say, well, I did it, I feel fine. And
exactly.
it's like,
Yeah.
well, okay, that doesn't, I don't really care about that. Um, and then, sometimes you can't, we know anecdotes aren't objective evidence, they don't prove anything. But, sometimes you can't just dismiss it and say, I don't care if you felt better on this. I don't care if you did this and you felt better. There's no evidence for it. Sometimes you have to be like, okay, it's understandable, but what they can't do is then go tell everyone else to do it because of that. Um, Sometimes if someone says, like, I think like with kombucha, there's not a lot of evidence supporting it, but
No.
a lot of people do say it makes them feel better. So it's like you can't just say, well, you're stupid. There's no proof of that.
It
Um,
tastes good sometimes. Not all the
I
flavors, but
I don't think so, but it's one of those things that's like, if you take it and then it makes you feel better, fine. It's likely not going to cause harm or have any negative effects. So that's when you can say, you can do it if you want. But with only consuming meat, that's not one of those things where you can say, yeah, it probably is not going to do any harm because it definitely will. And it should be criminal to be promoting these things, honestly. And it is in some cases with what people do. It is considered criminal.
it seems like carnivore was kind of the response to the almost militant veganism that was occurring. Because I mean, so I would consider I'd say 90% of the time, I would consider my diet to be plant based, and it depends on seasonal availability of produce and everything like that. Because that you have to we live in the real world,
Yeah,
but I think that's one of the things that a lot of people don't want to talk about is the difference between plant based and vegan, and we don't have to get into that because we could talk about it all day again, but I mean, that is somewhere where you can live. You can live in the plant based and still get animal products because
yeah,
human beings had animal products for a very long time. So
yeah.
it's probably good to consider that. All right. So moving on, it may be hard to narrow it down to one specific one, but the most misunderstood aspect of nutrition by everyday people. What pops into your head?
Um, let's see. I would say this may not answer specifically to like nutrition in terms of like food products and nutrients and things like that. But mine would be who is the actual individual, who's the professional, who's the credible source to provide this information. Because um, this field isn't really treated as something you have to be a professional on, something that you have to go to school for, something you have to be credentialed for, because everyone eats, everyone
Exactly.
has
Yeah.
something to say on it, everyone thinks it's something easy. Not everyone's performing surgery every day, so they don't say, "Oh, I can do it. It's fine." Um,
Everybody that loses 10 pounds on a diet says everybody has to
yeah.
try this specific one.
So like going off of that, like some people think that, and I know this is something that I would get a lot of hate for saying, is that, your personal trainer, anyone who has a nutrition certification that is honestly holds no value.
Mhm.
These people aren't the ones that legally can provide this kind of information. I can email you the kind of legislation around it so you can read it more and see why the majority of people are breaking the law. But it's like the same vein as saying, I read an anatomy book, I watched a video how to perform spine surgery, I can be an orthopedic surgeon now. Like it's that level of taking a 4 week online course in nutrition or whatever and saying, okay, I can now tell this individual how to eat. It's not that simple. Um,
Yeah, that's one of the
and
things
yeah,
that frustrates me the most about personal trainers, is the lackadaisical way that we hand out meal plans. I
yeah,
believe that
meal
I gave
plans
meal.
specifically, that's like the one big illegal thing that you can't do unless you're a dietitian.
God, it's yeah. I mean that is the obvious one. Like that's almost where
Yeah,
the line is drawn completely. You are not a dietitian. You are not allowed to tell
yeah,
somebody exactly what to eat. And obviously, you can give suggestions and guidance, which you should be doing, and you should have an understanding of nutrition. But telling somebody to eat this, this, and this, and even at
mm,
this and this time, I
yeah,
still see. I mean, I'm not going to name names, but there's a physique gym in the area, a bodybuilding gym in the area that literally will give the same meal plan to everybody with slight variations. And I'm not even talking about two bodybuilders. I'm talking about two
yeah,
normal people because that's who pays the bills. That there's
mm,
much more normal people than bodybuilders, and you give them. Oh gosh, this one was pretty bad because there was also a specific supplementation regimen that you had
oh
to
no,
follow with it, and it was literally just whoever this company that they were getting kickbacks from. And like, I wish there was some kind of task force. I'm sure the health department is busy right now with COVID and everything, but I wish there was some kind of task force just going around, just this
yeah,
identifying these kind of practices because they are extremely, I would say they're extremely detrimental to the field
yeah,
and the people within it.
yeah. One thing I've noticed is, again, I won't name any names, but some of like the more well-known and more popular like um, personal trainer like certification bodies, like those where you take the class and take the exam to be a certified personal trainer. Um, I've noticed through people I know who have done those things, um, they've shared with me some of the information that it's like either with like lifting or they provide nutrition information. Um, I've seen it and it's just like this is completely wrong. Like it's not correct information that they're teaching. Like
Yeah.
it's like no ifs, ands, or buts. Like this is not correct. And
You have to
then
learn
they
what
give
they want
yeah,
you to know for the
yeah.
test. And it's like you look at it like, okay, well that's 20 years outdated. You just
And then
haven't
yeah, and
changed it.
then you want these people to be working with individuals, teaching them this apparent wrong stuff that they learned. And I would say for like, especially with nutrition, the average person, the personal trainer, can tell people what the current guidelines say and say, these are the suggested guidelines already established. But as soon as it gets individualized, that's where the line stops because to be in charge of someone's health like that is not something that you can just do without any kind of qualifications. And these like month-long or 4 week nutrition certification courses or whatever, that won't hold up in court if you get sued. Those should be used more for, and they're not accredited by anything. There's no guarantee that the information they provide is correct. And again, it doesn't give you the right or power to do anything with it. But it should be used more for personal enrichment as
You get to put
opposed to
that in your Instagram bio, though. That's all that matters.
yeah. Yeah, it should be used more for personal enrichment as opposed to now working with individuals because it's just nowhere near enough time or training or education or certification to be able to actually do that legally.
Yeah. I mean, I took this must have been almost 5 years now. I took fitness nutrition specialist from NASM, and I did not even read the coursework. I just took the test and passed it. So
Yeah,
that's kind of how low the bar is
I
for
know. And
us.
then yeah, and then these people want to be telling people how to eat, telling and it's kind of difficult when it gets into what's non-medical and what's medical. Um, I highly doubt these people are asking their clients or whatever if they have any diseases, if they have any health risks, because if they do, then even more so they're breaking the law, and that would be even more of a even more of an imprisonment time. But like, it's hard. Again, I'll show you what the legislation says, and it's going to vary by state, and of course it'll be up to the interpretation of the court on how they'd want to apply that to the situation. But generally, it's like anyone can provide information based on already established guidelines, and that does not apply to individualized care. They can tell you what the safe internal cooking temperatures are for meats. They can, go to My Plate and say, here, this is what this says. They can go to the dietary guidelines for Americans and say, this is what this says. This is a general healthy pattern to have. They can, tell you how to safely cook things, how to safely prepare things that already have guidelines established. But the line is pretty drawn when that you try to tailor things into individuals or groups.
Yeah. The interesting thing is I continue to read. I'm learning a lot about behavior change right now. And the complex psychological and social and cultural obstacles to behavior change. And I keep coming across the idea that like the nutrition information, the exercise information, that stuff is almost the least important aspect. It's how do you get people to adhere to some sort of plan, and that comes from creating these behavior changes. So when we, as personal trainers or coaches, we focus so much on learning about the nutrition, like yes, that is important. You have to have a baseline of that, but that's not where the people aren't going to reach their goals from. They're going to
Mm-hmm.
not reach their goals because they're not changing their behavior around. So I feel like we are almost focusing on the wrong thing with missing the forest through the trees because we are focusing on nutrition, but that's not going to be the roadblock that people hit. They're going to be the roadblock they're going to hit is not putting these best practices into practice. And how do you get them to do that? And you have to understand that it goes much deeper than eat this many carbs, this many fat, this much
Mm-hmm.
fat, this much protein every day.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's
but
yeah, yeah.
yeah. So
That's something we have to learn is how to obviously work with people because the it comes down to even as a dietitian, I can't make someone do anything. I just have to be able to provide the best information um, that may help them make the decision. But like you said, if they're in the pre-contemplative state, they're not going to want to change. So you have to, as much as like as easy as it would be to say this is how you should do it, this is the best for you, and they do it. That's not how it really works.
not at all.
You have to work with someone with what they want to do, and kind of like weave around of trying to maybe coerce them towards a certain way, but you'd have to work with what they want to do, or else nothing's going to happen.
Yeah, this book right here, one of the most like beneficial motivational interviewing and nutrition and fitness. I
Mm-hmm.
read the healthcare one first, and it was pretty brutal, but this one's a lot more focused on fitness and stuff. So it's incredibly helpful, and I think that it's one of the most missed aspects for personal trainers specifically.
Mm-hmm.
All right, moving on to the final question. This is the most deep and most existential out of all of them. How can the industry of nutrition, the nutrition space in general, improve overall?
I think there just, it's easy to say, but there just needs to be um, more forced regulation on who's doing what. Obviously, that's extremely hard to do because you can't put a tracker on everyone and know what they're doing at any given time. But the stuff that's like a parent out there, stuff that's on social media. It's there. It's obvious. You can see it, but it'd be impossible to have a group in charge of just going after these people because it's just not feasible. But more education and awareness of who the professionals are in the field. Like everyone knows, someone says they're a doctor, they know, oh, they went to med school. They know how hard med school is. It's long and all that. But if someone says, I'm a dietitian, no one knows what the hell you're talking about. They don't know the school you had to go to, the training you had to go to. It mirrors medical school very similarly. It's just shorter. We have um, the schooling aspect, obviously. We have our rotations with all the different clinical, food service, community settings. We have all our different rotations, and we have the board examination. So, like with all healthcare professionals, kind of follow that similar path: education, supervised practice, and then board certification. So, just more awareness of who the professional is, who is not the professional, and like just like what kind of information. And I hate to say it's up to the individual to know what's
Yeah.
going on, but there is some kind of degree of responsibility of the individual to have a general sense of how things work. Obviously, you can't know how everything works, but at least if you hear something, critically think, go do a little bit of time looking through Google, looking through Google Scholar, and just trying to see, is this maybe realistic or is it pretty far-fetched?
Yeah, I'm still going through school right now, but one of the most important things that I got from higher education was what I call bullshit filter. I don't even know who I stole that
Yeah.
from, but because you can look at, like, if you understand basic mechanisms of physiology and nutrition, you can, okay, well, that clearly is not the
Hmm.
case. Like I mentioned that I keep seeing this ad. It's somebody drinks a little shot glass and of some kind of secret supplement, and fat just melts off. I'm like, well, that's not accurate, and that is not, physically possible. So I was able to put that filter up. But I think they, the marketing can get
Hmm.
real smart and get around those for a
Yeah.
lot of people.
A lot
The
of
pub,
things can a lot of things can be dismissed by saying, that's just not how things work.
yeah,
And you hate to just say that, but sometimes it is as simple as that. Like that's just not how things work.
maybe we need to get more nutrition education in like the primary schools and stuff like that. When
Yeah,
when
yeah,
you're,
definitely.
yeah, I took
Especially as it's
one.
becoming such a prevalent problem with things like obesity, diabetes, hypertension, as like two-thirds of the population is obese. It's obviously a problem.
So public awareness around what dietitians do, and what professionals in these industries are allowed to say, allowed to do, allowed to
Hmm.
prescribe, things like that. I think that would be a good step to creating, because like you said, I mean, you walk on the street and ask 10 people how,
Yeah,
how hard is it to be a doctor? They would know. And they
yeah.
ask how hard is it to be a dietitian? Nobody is going to know.
No, yeah, nobody knows what it is anyway.
And it's weird because you're right, everybody does eat, and that's why everybody can have an opinion
Yeah.
on it. But when it comes down to who the heck you should listen to,
Hmm.
it's tough. It can definitely be tough
Yeah.
because a lot of people out there are better than dietitians in terms of their marketing and their social media prowess
Yeah.
and things like that. So
And there's definitely are, like, this goes for every single profession, but there are dietitians that are not good that I don't think should have their credentials. They, you know, go outside of the code of ethics a little bit. They don't hold to, you know, our responsibility to provide evidence-based information. So there are bad people out there, and there are good people who don't have our credentials that were probably better than some dietitians. But again, it might come down to someone wanting to do what we as a dietitian can be able to do without putting in the necessary work to get into the field.
yeah, it's easier to just put some stuff on social, get some
Yeah,
followers,
yeah.
stuff like that. All right, man. Well, this was awesome. I really appreciate you coming on
Hmm.
and talking to us, and really dispelling a lot of myths, and like a lot of these conversations end up just creating a ton of nuance, and like like you said, it depends and stuff like that. But
Yeah,
I think that they're incredibly valuable because people just aren't really aware of the basics, and then also that we can be manipulated very easily. I mean, it's a human tendency
yeah,
to want to take the shortcut to things. So
yeah.
appreciate it.
We could spend so much time on each of these topics, but
Yeah, absolutely. We'll
we're
do that.
we're limited in time.
Yeah, we'll do that again in the future sometime. But thanks again, man. Have a good rest of your day.